Daffodils are blooming all over Brasstown, all over other places too, I'm sure. This is the time of the year when that first little burst of flowers that you see that makes you think and makes you know that spring is almost here. Each spring when I see the daffodils blooming, that makes me think of new birth. That's what spring represents to a lot of us. But it also makes me think of the past. Because as I drive around, I notice daffodils certainly blooming in people's yards before they've planted them, but I also notice daffodils blooming where there's nothing. There's no houses, there's no structure. There's not even a semblance of where a structure used to be, and there daffodils are blooming. You'll also notice yellow bells like that too. Forsythia, we call it yellow bells. But those daffodils, they remind me of the people that lived there. And I wonder, who were they and who planted them? Did a mother plant them like me? Did a grandmother plant them, a grandfather? Maybe even a husband who was trying to prove to his wife that things were going to get better? But I think it's just a symbol that even those people are long gone, there's something of beauty that they created, that they planted themselves, and there it is all these years later, still blooming in Brasstown and in other places for us to be reminded of the past and to remind us that life goes on and that every spring we get to start anew. It's kind of like a new rebirth, but I really enjoy seeing those old daffodils. And of course, because I've lived in Brasstown my whole life, I know where to look. I know exactly where there are some. Some of them just down the road between here and the folk school, there's some on a big hill, and my pap, he told me that was where one of his great uncles and aunts lived when he was a boy. There's never been a house there in my lifetime, but every time I see those flowers, I think about Oscar and Dude. That was their names. I knew them when I was a little child. They had moved away by then, and they didn't live in Brasstown anymore. Then over towards Martins Creek, there's some that grow in the field, and Pap told me that at one time when he was a boy, there was a store there, and people lived beside the store. So that's in a cow pasture now, but when I see those daffodils, I think of that store, and I think of Pap as a young boy walking there, with his parents or by himself or being sent there to pick up something, and all the other people in Martins Creek and Brasstown that visited that store. So daffodils are a really special flower to me. And now I'm going to take you to my favorite daffodils. These where you can see sitting around me here. These are in my yard, ones I've planted over the years, but I'm going to take you on a little journey and show you my favorite daffodils. So now I've hiked up in the woods to show you my favorite daffodils, and wouldn't you know it, they're not blooming. I was kind of afraid of that, but you can see the beautiful green spears, like that's what they remind me of, or swords that are into the air, raised into the air, and before you know it, there will be blooms. These daffodils are like a double daffodil, like kind of looks frilly. But they're my favorite ones because they're at an old home place. Well, if I show you the woods around me, here you can take a look at where I'm sitting. And you'll notice there's nothing. You can't see anything, right? Well, back in behind me, that way, there was a house at one time. And that's the house that my great-grandfather lived in with his family. And it burnt down. They even called it, when I was growing up, Pap would say, by the burnt down place, by the burnt down place. That's what they called it. Anyway, trees and time has went on and erased all traces of that home unless you knew it was there. But these daffodils are here and they bloom every spring. Now I don't know if my grandmother, my great-grandmother Carrie, if she planted them or if it was a house. In those days, a lot of people were transient and they went from house to house to house. At least my family did. I know the Wilsons did. So I'm not sure they built the house. That may have already been built and then they moved into it. Well, if they did, it's likely maybe these flowers were already here. I do know that she liked flowers, that she loved flowers. I have a really good memory of being in her flower garden with her. She died when I was about 5 years old, but that's like a really bright memory that I have of her being in her big grandma's flower bed. And that was not at this place. That was back in Wilson Holler, back down the holler where I live now, in that general area. Anyway, but these are my favorite daffodils just because I think of those people, my family who walked the same paths that I'm walking now, and they're all gone, all of them. But the memories, you know, they remain in your heart where you hold them. But that's one of the reasons I love daffodils, is those, like I was telling you, when you notice them growing in out of the way places. I've heard people say that for old home sites, especially in my area of Appalachia, that's like a dead giveaway. In the spring of the year, you'll notice yellow bells, forsythia, and daffodils, and that's like a sure sign that it was inhabited one time, because those things are not native to our area. Another story about daffodils back down where I live, of course, Granny has them in her yard. She liked to plant long rows of them so they'd all be in a row. I have them just scattered all over the place. Well, we've lived in our house, I guess 20-something years now. The girls were, well, gosh, hard to believe how fast time goes by, but I think we lived there 3 days before I had the girls, maybe 2 days anyway, and so they're 24 years old. Hard to believe. Anyway, so we've lived there that long. When we first moved into the house, we only graded out enough, really basically for a house seat. There was no yard or anything, and we just kind of made do with that until the girls got, I don't know, they may have been 8, 9, 10 years old, something like that, and we began to realize, well, you know, it'd be really nice if we had a bigger place for them to play. It'd be really nice if we had a place for a garden instead of having to use Pap's big garden. So we decided we were going to have things graded out again, have it graded around the house, have more room. Well, that was great, but there was one problem. I had flowers everywhere. So I spent days, I spent weeks, I dug all my flowers up and I carried them to a place kind of between mine and Granny's house in the woods, in this little, where actually a dozer years ago had pushed out a road. Not a road for anybody to live on or anything, but it was just, I guess it was from leftover from when they were building Pap's house. And I put all my flowers right there in that little area. And then thought, once the grading's done, then I'll plan where I want to put them all back, and then I'll gradually bring them back home, you know. It was a real labor of love because I loved them. And most all of my flowers come from someone, either my aunts or Granny or people like that donated, give them to me, you know, donated them to me. Anyway, so one night, right when they were doing the grading, the day before they were supposed to come, Pap got really sick in the night. I mean, just desperately sick. And he was a veteran, so the hospital that he would go to was our VA hospital, which is about 2 hours away. It's in Otine, or near Asheville. Pap always called it Otine. People there locally would. Anyway, so that's where we would travel to. We do have a local hospital, but that hospital had all Pap's records, and it's a much bigger, larger hospital, and they could just they could do tests and just immediately know what was going on, you know, where our local hospital is really small and don't have that capabilities. So it was way in the night, and he decided he needed to go. Actually, I guess it was way in the night when we come back. So it was probably like late evening, maybe 10, 11 o'clock, something like that, when he decided he had to go to the hospital. You know, it was really bad. So it was me and him and Granny. I went and took him. We went. And our trip was crazy from the beginning. The VA had changed since we'd been there, so we went in what we thought was the emergency room, and they'd changed it to the other side of the hospital, so we weren't. Anyway, we finally did get to the emergency room, and we finally did get Pap in there, and what was wrong was his pancreas was infected. So it was really good that we went, and they did all the necessary tests, and they give him some antibiotics I don't remember if they give him a shot or a short time of IV. Anyway, immediately they diagnosed it, and that's what it was, and he was soon going to be better. Well, then we had to drive home, of course, that 2 hours. I got so sleepy, I thought I would die that night. And I would pinch myself. I remember pinching myself all the way through the Nantahala Gorge. Granny couldn't really drive at night very good, and I think I had a straight shift at that time, so she couldn't drive that anyway. And then Pap was sick, so I wasn't gonna make him drive. So I was just doing everything to try to keep myself awake. And I remember we got to Marble, which is close, is not far. That's basically, we were home from Brasstown, and I was like, I'm sorry, Pap, but I'm either going to have to pull over and take a nap, or you're going to have to drive the rest of the way home. Of course, he said, I'll drive, I'm fine. The deer hunter, after that, when I told him, Matt, he laughed at me. He said, if I'd have drove all the way to Marble, I'd have made it the rest of the way home. I said, I literally could not. I was about to pass out. Anyway, all that story, get back to the daffodils. So when I got home, as you might imagine, I went straight to bed, basically passed out, and slept. I slept way up in the day the next day. I didn't even hear the dozers, the graders, they come to grade, and I didn't even hear them. And probably 1 or 2 o'clock or something like that, I woke up, and Matt said, you better look outside, your whole yard's different. So I did, and of course I was amazed. I couldn't believe, how much work they'd done while I laid there sleeping. I was just exhausted from all the stress and the trauma and taking Pap out there in the middle of the night. Anyway, so once they were finished, of course we seeded grass and done all that, and I began to put all my flowers back where they belonged, over little by little. I got them all out of the woods. Well, it's probably the next spring or so. One day I was on my way down to Granny's and Pap's to see them or to get something, who knows what, and something caught my eye out of the corner of my eye, and I looked over there in the woods where I'd had all my flowers, and there was a daffodil blooming. So I obviously didn't get them all, and I thought, oh, that little daffodil, there it is all by itself in the woods, and I knew it was one of mine, but I left it. So that's another daffodil that this time of the year, if I walk down at Granny's and I notice it out of the corner of my eye over there in the woods, I know I'm reminded of that night taking Pap all the way to the VA. I'm reminded of the wonder of having a larger yard so that I could have a garden, all that. It's kind of like life is. The trauma of Pap, which he turned out he was okay once he got the antibiotics and everything, that was all right. And then also the blessing that we were able to get our yard graded, so we had a place for Corey and Katie to ride bicycles and a place to garden. So that's a lot of stories about daffodils that you may not have wanted to hear, but I've got one more that I want to read you that I just love. If you've never read Lee Smith, she writes great books. A lot of them are about Appalachia, fiction books. She's one of my favorite authors, and her books are readily accessible. Most anywhere you look, you're going to find them because she's really well known and been really successful. But this was out of her book, Agate Hill, and this is just a little quote I want to read you. On we went, her red coat flitting in and out of the trees ahead of me. Sometimes she seemed not even to touch the ground. We came into the clear and struck out along a fence row, surprising the little birds that flew up all around us. We passed that pile of rocks which used to be a chimney of an old homestead. We know because daffodils pop up there every spring. Fanny said, daffodils remember when the people are all gone. That's my favorite part. So daffodils remember when the people are all gone. I hope you enjoyed this little jaunt about daffodils. Even though I hiked all the way up here and these weren't blooming, it was still a beautiful hike, and I'm glad I come, and I'm glad I brought you along with me. I hope you'll leave me a comment and tell me if you like daffodils as much as I do. Oh, and if you call them, do you call them jonquils like Granny? Do you call them daffodils, March flowers, Easter lilies, buttercups? I think that was all of them. Let me know what you call them. But mostly I just hope you'll drop back by often as I celebrate Appalachia.